Thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. For more information, check the affiliate link in the description. Recently, Gorillaz released a new music video, Cracker Island, and in it there was this really cool looking effect that caught my eye, and in fact there was even a Reddit post on the After Effects subreddit discussing how this effect was made, so I decided to give it a shot, and this is the final result. Now, I'm not saying this is an exact one-to-one recreation of the effect, but trying to reverse engineer pretty much anything is always a good learning experience. In fact, take a look at the first attempt at doing this effect. At first I thought I nailed it, but then the next day when looking at it with a fresh eye, I realized just how distracting the effect was, but with some more effort and a bit more time, I was able to arrive at the final version. There are a few things I noticed when playing around with this effect. Having a dark background and a bright foreground with your subject in light will make the effect work a lot better because you'll be able to keep the focus on the subject and not affect the background as much. As for the colorizing part, making the footage black and white first and then rotoscoping either manually or by using the roto brush tool and then adding unique colors to specific areas of your shot gives you much more control than using the original colors from your footage. Of course, that's not to say you shouldn't use the original colors. Feel free to do so if you want to. In fact, in the original version, you can clearly notice the skin tones on his hand, so they definitely kept some of the original colors. For this tutorial, I used this clip from a music video we did, and as you can see, we have high contrast lighting on our subject with a dark background, and the original shot is black and white, but if your shot has color, then you could simply desaturate it. In the Gorillaz version, one part of the effect is this trailing clone look, which we could achieve by first creating outlines of our subject with the find edges effect, and then leave a cloning trail by using the echo effect. To spice things up, we will also take a look at adding some light streaks and glow, this lagging chromatic aberration look, and some finer details like glitter and blur. You can get the project files for this tutorial on my Gumroad page, which will include the original footage so you can practice and follow along, and the project file itself. You don't have to pay for it, but you do have the option for donating in case you want to support the channel. Weekend Visual Effects is a tutorial series where we recreate all kinds of effects, so feel free to leave a comment down below with any suggestions or any questions that you might have. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here we are now in After Effects, and as you can see I have all of the original comps open just in case we need to go back to them later on, but we'll go ahead and close them by either clicking Ctrl W or Ctrl Alt W to close every single comp. Now let's also make sure we're set to 32 bits per channel because we will be using a bunch of glow effects, and so it's always nice to have as much data as possible, so you can toggle between that by holding down Alt and then left click to go to 32. Now the clip we're going to use for this tutorial is from this music video, and here I have a comp that has that clip imported, and I've gone ahead and chopped up 3 clips here. This is the one I used in the original version, but then there's this other one, and then there's this other one as well. But let's shut those off and we'll focus only on this one, and then later on we can maybe switch it out just to see how it looks when we use the effects on different clips. We'll create a new comp by clicking this button here, and we'll name this clip tut for tutorial. We'll set the frame rate to 25 since that's the same as the music video clip. Duration of 5 seconds is fine, and we'll do 1080p and hit OK. Then we'll go back to that comp, select this first clip, and then go over to Edit, Copy, and then go back to this comp, we'll do Edit, Paste. Now this is 4K, so we'll right click, transform, fit to comp, or use the Ctrl Alt F shortcut. And we're working in 1080p just for the sake of the tutorial so we can move a bit faster. Now let's bring the work area and hold down Shift to snap it to the end of the clip, and then right click, trim comp to work area. And so now our comp length is the same as our clip length. And we'll leave this clip inside of its own comp so that later we can replace this clip with whatever we want, and that will reflect across all the other comps. We'll click and drag this clip tut comp into a new comp, and what I like to do is actually just go 0 clip tut, and then on the second one we'll do 1 colorization tut. I like to add a number before the name just so I know exactly in what order these comps are being used. Then we'll double click on the colorization.comp, and then right here we'll right click and turn this into a guide layer. And the reason we're doing this is because we only want to use this clip as a guide layer in this comp, just so we can colorize things, but we don't want it to show up in other comps. Now let's go forward a bit, maybe find a spot here where we can see most of the subject. And originally the guitar scenes here in the music video are black and white, so I didn't add any effects to this. But say you have a clip that has color. Well, I found that the best way to work with this kind of effect is to tint your footage beforehand and then add all of the colorization effect by masking out specific areas. And so just in case you're using a colored clip, go back to your comp, add a tint effect to this. So right click, color correction, tint, and you're good to go. Now let's create a new adjustment layer and we'll call this one color. By the way, I'm hitting return on the keyboard to rename the layer, and then we can also color code these. And for colorizing, you could use, say, a curves or hue saturation effect. So let's add those. We'll hit Control Space to bring up the FX Console plugin, which I like to use. And it allows you to just search for an effect like curves and hit return to add it. It is a third-party tool from Video Copilot, but it is totally free. So I highly recommend that you check it out. Or if you do not have it, just go over to the Effects and Presets panel and type in curves and just drag and drop that in. And let's say go over to the red channel and we'll boost the red channel up. And then on the blue channel, we'll maybe tone that down a bit. And then on the green channel, we'll maybe give it a bit of an S curve like so. And here we have a fiery orangish looking shot. Or we could also say use hue saturation. So we'll delete the curves effect and check the colorize button here. We'll boost the saturation a bit and then shift the hue until we have the color that we want. But what I like to do instead is use the color vibrance effect, which is also from Video Copilot, but it is totally free. It has this single color value, which we can pick. So let's say blue. And right away, that gives us a very similar look to what we had before, but in a much easier and faster way. Then we can use the other options here. So we have vibrance, which sort of controls the saturation. There's also preserve luminance, which if we zoom in here and look at the highlights, if we bring this down, that basically introduces more of the color into the highlights. Then we also have brightness and gamma to control the contrast of the image. So if we increase the brightness, of course, the image becomes brighter, and then also decrease the gamma to give it more contrast. There's also more options here, but we'll take a look at those once we get further into the tutorial. Anyway, we'll set this to kind of like a pinkish color, and then we'll select the adjustment layer and hit Ctrl D to duplicate or go to Edit, Duplicate. And this adjustment layer is gonna affect the arms. So let's change the color to something like orangish yellow. But as we do that, things do get messy, and that's because we need to first add a tint effect. So we'll do tint and bring that before the color vibrance. So if we shut this off, what we're doing is taking away all of the colors and then adding the color vibrance, because the color vibrance effect works best with grayscale values. So you want to have everything set to black and white and then colorize them. Now we can grab the pen tool and say, draw around the arm here like so. We'll do a rough mask real quick and then maybe hit F, bring up the feather a bit. And there we have isolated a different color to our arm. And then we can also duplicate this, hit M, we'll delete the masks, and we'll rename this to guitar, and even change the color to blue. And then we'll draw another rough mask around the guitar this time, and also feather this out a bit. Now there is a slight issue this time around, and that's because the guitar adjustment layer is on top of the arms layer. And so the hand here becomes blue as well because it is within the contours of the mask. So to fix that, simply drag and drop the guitar adjustment layer underneath the arms layer. And that way the arms layer is gonna tint the blue color and then colorize it on top. So yeah, just make sure you order your layers in a way that makes sense. You could also use the roto brush tool up here, but in the original version, I rotoscoped everything manually, even though it did take a bit more time because I was having trouble with the roto brush tool due to there being a lot of detail and not many clear silhouettes on the subject. Either way, I'll quickly show you how you would go about automating this process with the roto brush tool. So we'll select the clip, then make sure you have the roto brush tool selected, and then double click on the clip, which will open it up as a layer. And now let's say draw across this arm here, and then we can hold down Alt, which makes the circle go red, and then subtract from this area. And usually the roto brush tool actually does a pretty good job, especially if there is a good contrast between two areas. Then what we can do is click freeze, which will bake the mask onto our layer, and that way it doesn't have to re-render all the time. And of course, you would go ahead and go frame by frame before baking everything so that you can make adjustments to it by adding or subtracting areas and then freeze it. But for the sake of the tutorial, we'll skip over that part. But we'll go back to the composition now, and you can see our clip has been isolated to just the arm. And sure, we could duplicate this and rename this to say arm, and then on the original clip, we can disable the roto brush, and we'll solo out just these two layers so that you can see when we add, say, color vibrance, we can tint just that area. However, I would say it's much better to add the effects onto an adjustment layer instead. So to do that, we'll delete the arm layer and we'll select the clip tut, we'll re-enable the roto brush tool, and then with it selected, we'll go over to layer, auto trace, make sure the work area is checked, and we're using the alpha channel of that layer so that After Effects can trace a mask around it. Now, if we have the preview box checked here, you can see how that mask is gonna look like roughly. And you can also have this mask be applied to a new layer and hit OK. Now, once we have the new layer, we can select it, hit M, select the mask, Control C to copy, and let's just say duplicate this adjustment layer. We'll hit M, delete the original masks, and we'll go to the beginning and then hit Control V to paste the auto traced mask. And now we can solo that, maybe delete this one, and also disable the roto brush. And again, this is just in case you want to use the roto brush tool and don't want to bother with animating the masks manually. But anyway, I'll select all of these adjustment layers that we created up until now and we'll delete them, unsolo the clip, and we'll go back to the original colorization comp and we'll just select these three adjustment layers and copy and paste them here. And if I select them, hit U to bring up the keyframes, you can see the masks have been animated because I don't want to re-animate these masks from scratch. And let me tell you, if you want to test your patience, just do rotoscoping. Now on the bottom adjustment layer, you can see that I've put the vibrance down a bit to 0.5 and also preserved the luminance so I can introduce some color back into the highlights. And that's because I wanted to focus the attention mostly to the guitar here. And when we select that, you can see that everything else is set to 1. We also have the arms, which have been set to 0.75 and also to 0.5. And again, that's just to focus the attention mainly to the guitar. And by the way, I do want to say that your masks don't have to be anywhere near perfect because after we add all of the post-processing effects, you will hardly be able to notice all of these misalignments in the edges. Another thing you may notice is this hue saturation effect that I added to only the arms. And that's because I wanted to add some hue shift to just the arms color. So you can see here I have two keyframes which go from -20 to 20. Now you could go ahead and add a new adjustment layer and call this, say, hue shift and add the hue saturation effect. And then say set a keyframe here, hit U, bring this over here, and we'll do, I don't know, maybe a full cycle. And then once you preview that, you'll be able to see a full color spectrum shift throughout the timeline. But let's not make it too drastic. Instead, we'll do -10 at the beginning and then 10 all the way at the end. And keep in mind, these are the colors that I chose and kind of based them off of the Gorillaz music video, but you can choose whatever colors you want. Now, back in the project panel, we'll drag that colorization tut comp into another new comp, and we'll call this clip colorization tut. Now, you're not going to be able to see anything here for the time being because we have the clip set to a guide layer, and we're only seeing the adjustment layers, which right now are doing nothing. So we'll grab the original clip tut, we'll drag that right underneath our colorization tut. And now what we're looking to do is have the adjustment layers inside of this comp affect this clip tut. And all we need for that to happen is to check this sun icon, which turns on the collapse transformations, which essentially treat all of the layers that are inside of this comp as if they are inside of this comp instead. And now it might look like we ended up with the same thing that we had before right here, but do bear with me for a moment. Let's now grab the clip tut. Once again, we'll drag that into a new comp, and this one we'll rename to outlines colorization tut. Double click to open it up, and we'll also once again bring the colorization tut in here and collapse transformations to colorize it. And so now by having these two comps independent of each other, we can composite them back into another comp and then add effects like glow and echo to this outlines comp only so that we don't mess up the look of the entire shot. We'll start off by shutting this off for a moment so we can focus only on the clip. And first we'll add the curves effect, which will help us dial in the contrast. So we'll boost the highlights a bit and darken the shadows. Now we'll do find edges, and let's just first invert it because we want to have bright lines and a dark background. And the way the find edges effect works is it creates lines wherever dark pixels and bright pixels meet. So when I turn this on, because this area is dark and the hand here is bright, a line gets created. Now we are also getting a bunch of detail here in the skin, also down there on the ground, which we can fix by adding a fast box blur effect before the find edges. And let's say set this to 1, for example, and that gets rid of a majority of those finer details. Now let's also add the Luma key effect, which allows us to key out the clip based on the luminance. So we'll set it to key out darker and then increase the threshold. And as we do that, you can see that the darker parts of the image get cut off. So in cases where we don't want as much detail in those darker areas like the arm there, which could be a bit distracting, we can increase this, and we'll set it to say 20 for now, and even increase the edge feather a bit. And there we have our outline, which we can always go back to the curves effect and maybe boost the contrast. Also make sure to check repeat edge pixels, but I'm actually gonna go ahead and disable that. And for this specific effect, I actually like having more finer detail. Now, say we wanna choke the thickness of these lines, an easy way to do that would be to add the color vibrance effect one more time. Instead of colorizing it, we're only gonna use it to extract a transparent background, which is this matte alpha option at the end. And if we set that to only and enable the transparency box, you can see that it has gotten rid of all of the black values. And this way we can add the simple choker effect and increase it just a little bit. You could also maybe increase this alpha boost value, which helps out a bit more with the outlines. And then hold down Control as you're sliding the choke matte to tweak it in more finer increments. But in this case, I'm actually gonna delete both of these because I do want some thicker lines, and then turn on the colorization at this point. Now we can go back to the project panel and we'll select the 2 latest comps, drag and drop them into a new comp. We'll rename this to Composite Tut, which is where we're going to combine everything together, like the base clip and the outlines. By the way, if you hear some constant noise in the background, that's because there's some huge drilling going on in another building, and it's so intense that we can hear it all the way here. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Let's hit F4 to toggle the switches, or we can click this button down here. And we'll set the outlines blending mode to screen. Now we'll go ahead and add the VC color vibrance effect. And just as before, we'll extract only the alpha and boost the alpha as well. And we'll solo it out for a moment, just so we can see what happens when we add the echo effect. Now we'll set the echo operator to composite in back because we don't want to have any lighting changes. We just want to composite all of the echo copies behind the original copy. Now, if we didn't first have a transparent background on the outlines, things would be a bit weird. And you can see that if I turn off the color vibrance, basically what we're doing, compositing those echoes with the dark values. And if we set the number of echoes up to 5, you'll be able to see all of those dark values, which are going to pollute all the copies underneath. So by using the color vibrance and extracting the alpha channel from the black values, now we make sure that we don't darken all the copies which are going to be composited in the back. For the echo time, we'll set it to a bit of a higher value, like 0.02, and that's minus, by the way. So the echo happens in a bit of tighter increments, so it doesn't spread out as much. We'll leave the starting intensity to 1, which basically controls the opacity of the layers. As for the decay, we'll set it to 0.5, and by the way, let me just switch off the transparency there. By having it to 1, every single copy will have the same opacity value that we set here. But by having it decay, every next copy will have less and less opacity. We can actually tweak that a little bit, maybe 0.65 or so. If we didn't split the outlines and the clip itself in separate comps, we would have to add the echo effect and any glow effects that we're gonna add right now on top of everything, not just the outlines. So that's the main reason behind splitting the clip and the outlines into their own comps. Anyway, we'll select this, we'll start adding some glow now. And for this first copy of the glow, we'll set the threshold down a bit so it affects more of the image. Then we'll increase the radius just a little bit to like 20 and decrease the intensity a lot to maybe like 0.1. So it's very subtle. Then we'll duplicate it. And for the second copy, we'll only increase the radius to 100 and then duplicate it one last time. And we'll do 300 on the radius. So we end up with this very smooth glow. By the way, in the original Gorillaz music video, you can see that there's a lot of motion blur going on in the original shot, which could be that they shot at a lower shutter speed to achieve this effect in camera. But let's just solo out the base clip and we'll add the pixel motion blur effect, which adds artificial motion blur based on the movement of the pixels. And we can sort of achieve a similar look. Maybe we'll even crank up the shutter angle to 360. And by increasing the shutter angle, we have more intense motion blur, but we also have to now increase the shutter samples so we don't see the banding in the samples there. Now, this effect does run very slow, so I would advise you turn it off for now and then re-enable it whenever you're ready to render out. So we'll shut it off, unsolo the clip. Now let's go ahead and add some more details. So we'll create a new solid here and we'll call this glitter. And then we can search for turbulent noise. You could even use the FX console as I showed you before. Now, turbulent noise is pretty much the same as fractal noise. The only difference being is that turbulent noise is slightly faster, but it also doesn't loop. So if you want a looping texture, just make sure you use fractal noise. In our case though, we don't need it to loop, and seeing as it does run a bit faster, we'll use that. And what we're looking to get is a field of stars almost. So we'll increase the contrast a lot to like 500 or even more than that. And then we'll decrease the brightness. So we have these very contrasty chunks. Now we'll go down to the transform and we want to scale this down a lot, maybe like 2. Maybe we'll bring the brightness back up a bit for some more stars. And then we'll alt click on the evolution and type in time times 1000, which will evolve this value by 1000 every single second, just to give us some variation in the texture along the timeline here. Then we'll go ahead and set this to add. Now this is affecting our entire shot. So what we want to do is instead use the set matte effect and choose the outlines layer, and also make sure you use the effects and masks so it takes into account the echo effect and the glow effects and everything, and use its luminance to determine where this layer is going to be visible. So wherever there are bright values in our outlines layer, that's where the glitter effect is going to be visible. And you can just make that out. By the way, we can boost the brightness of our comp here. This actually doesn't do anything to the render. This is just for viewing purposes. And you can see how that is being isolated just to the outlines. Now we could also tone down the opacity a bit, say maybe 20 or so. We want this to be very subtle, but it does add a lot of detail. We could also say add some glow to it. We'll decrease the threshold all the way down, and then we'll increase the intensity, maybe even decrease the radius. It's very tight, and you can see all of those little specks there. Maybe let's just do 0.5 and then 5 radius. Now for some even more detail, we'll duplicate the outlines layer and we'll solo it out for a moment. And we'll delete all of the effects by either selecting all of them and delete, or there's a cool shortcut to do that. Just select whatever layer you want and then hit Ctrl-Shift-E, which will delete all of its effects. And we'll rename this to Cross Blur. What we're trying to do is add some streaks of lights across our outlines. So we'll use an effect called CC Cross Blur, which allows us to blur the pixels horizontally and vertically independently. So we end up with these streaks of lights, kind of like plus shapes. Then we can use this transfer mode, maybe set it to screen to make them pop a bit more, and even repeat edge pixels so the edges there don't get messed up. Now we can unsolo this so we can see it in action with the other layers, and say set this to lighten, so it doesn't have any effect on the overall brightness. We're just adding some streaks of light on top. Now say we want these to be angled at 45 degrees. Well, an easy way to do that is to use the transform sandwich technique. So we'll add a transform effect. I'll bring this one up on top of the CC Cross Blur and we'll solo this out and say set the rotation to 45. Then we'll duplicate the transform effect, bring this one at the bottom, and for this one, we'll do minus 45 instead. And so what's happening is the layer is first being rotated, then we add the cross blur, which gives us these horizontal and vertical streaks, and then we derotate it, if that's even a word, by minus 45 to go back to whatever we had previously, and then we're left with these 45-degree streaks of light. Now the light streaks are a bit faint, and that's because we're blurring them, and when we use a blur effect on a layer, it tends to fade it out as well. So we'll use an exposure effect to boost the exposure back up, so we'll do something like, I don't know, maybe 2. Drop down the gamma correction to something like 0.5, so we add some more contrast. Now there are some very intense highlights here, and there's this effect called HDR highlight compression, which allows you to compress those highlights very easily. But we do need to add that to the outlines layer as well. And maybe we'll do 75% on this instead of 100. And that's just a quick and easy way to flatten some of those highlights without having to go into the individual effects and make tweaks there. Now, I should point out that there's actually a plugin that allows you to do these streaks of lights very easily, which is a third-party tool and it is paid. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, we'll select this, we'll drop down all of the effects and we'll disable them for a moment. And we'll add the effect which is called Glimmer from Red Giant's universe. Now let's solo solo it out, and what we can do is set the source opacity to 0, so we're left with only the light streaks. And what it does is it looks at the input channel that you set here, which in this case is the luminance, so the bright areas, and then adds these streaks of lights all across those bright areas. And you can make a bunch of adjustments here, like tweak the threshold so that you determine where those light streaks pop up. You can also change the streak length and a bunch more settings. You even have some presets up here, which you can just apply the preset and that should give you different looks. And of course, just make sure you set the source opacity to 0. And when you unsolo that, it's going to composite back on top of your other elements. Anyway, we'll delete that. That's just something I wanted to mention real quick. And we'll go back to our poor man's light streaks. Let's now create another adjustment layer. And we'll call this a burst glow. And add the effect CC radial fast blur. But we'll set the zoom to brightest and tone down the amount. And also lower the opacity down to 50%. So it's very subtle, just to make it look a bit more interesting. Alright, so there you go. It looks pretty sick up until this point. You can see the echo effect in action on the right side of the arm, the hand here, and also the guitar movement. And having different kinds of colors isolated to different parts of the subject here looks very sick indeed. Now finally, we'll drag the composite comp one more time into another comp. And here we'll add some chromatic aberration, some additional contrast and saturation tweaks, and some noise. And before we do anything else, I just want to point out that there is a third-party tool called Sapphire Time Warp RGB. We search for that, which is a third-party paid tool, but it pretty much does the exact same thing that you see in the original Gorillaz effect, which is this sort of lagging chromatic aberration. So if I go in frame by frame, there's some RGB split going on here. So we can see blue, red, very interesting look. So to add chromatic aberration, we'll duplicate this comp 2 more times. So we have 3 copies, and we'll do red, green, and blue. And I also like to color code these to match the corresponding channels. And we'll start by adding the shift channels effect on the first layer, which is the red channel. And we'll set the green and blue channels to full off. Then we'll copy that effect, paste it to the green. Then we'll tweak the green to take it from the green channel and set the red to off. And we'll do the same thing for the blue. Now we'll select all of them, set the blending mode to screen so they all blend with each other. Now, as soon as we go ahead and move one of these, you'll be able to see that RGB split effect. So we'll take the red, push it up a bit, and then the blue, we can maybe bring it down. But we want to be very subtle with this, and we'll select all of them, hit Control Home to reset the position to the center, and we'll select the red channel, and we'll move it 3 pixels up, and then 3 pixels to the left. As for the blue, we'll do 3 pixels down, and 3 pixels to the right. So you can see here, this is the before, this is after we do the chromatic aberration. And then to get that sort of lagging effect as the shot moves and the subject moves, what we'll do is add the echo effect one more time onto the red channel, and we'll leave all the settings as they are, and we'll just switch the operator to maximum. We'll copy and paste that to the blue. And instead for this one, let's just say set it to minimum so the dark pixels render on top of bright pixels. And we can focus down here to really see that rainbow effect happening. Let's just duplicate this, Control-Shift-E, delete the effects, go back to normal, just so we can compare the original version with this version, so you can see how much that adds. It might not be the exact same effect we're getting with the Sapphire Time Warp effect, but it is stylizing our shot a lot. Now, because we are moving the red and blue channels a bit, they might be cutting off here, so we'll create a new null object, and we'll call this scale. Select all of these, parent them to the null object, hit S, and then scale this null object to 101, just so we make sure we're not cutting off any layers here. Now let's finally add another adjustment layer, and we'll call this CC plus noise. And we'll add a curves effect, a hue saturation effect, and a noise effect. Boost the contrast just a little bit. And then I'm thinking we maybe tone down the saturation just a little bit. Maybe let's say -5 instead. And then finally add some noise as well. So we'll do 10% noise with color as well, because if we uncheck that, we'll just get grayscale noise. But in this case, I think it makes more sense just to use colored noise instead. All right, so there we go. We have the finished result pretty much. And is it one-to-one to the original Gorillaz music video effect? No. Is it the same to the original version that I did? Probably not, because we did tweak things along the way. But is it sick though? Absolutely not. I mean, yes, it is. It's looking fire. In fact, if I touch the screen right now, oh my God, I just burned my hand. Beware, don't touch the screen when you're working on this effect because it's way too hot. Anyway, before we wrap up, let's take a look at how we can change the clip. so we can use this effect on any shot we want. To do that, we'll go over to this comp where I have some clips saved up, and we'll copy, say, this one and break it right inside of the very first comp on the chain of our comps for this effect. Now we do need to go a bit further back and also right-click transform fit to comp because this is a 4K clip. Now we can go over to the colorization comp. Let's say shut off everything and we'll duplicate this one and we'll make it, I don't know, maybe blue, just so we don't need to rotoscope things, and we'll set the vibrance back to 1 and preserve luminance back to 1. And then we'll go over to the composite comp just to see how that looks like. And sure, we might not get the best result right away, but what we can do is say lock the comp viewer here, so we can see this comp at all times, even when we go back to other comps. And let's say go over to the outlines colorization, and what we can do is tweak the contrast or brightness here so we can have more of the outlines showing up. And also you may notice that there's not a much detail going on here except for on the guitar and then on the arms, which is always nice. As I mentioned before, you want to generally try to keep a dark background and have your subject in light. That way you don't have anything distracting going on in the background. Say the find edges effect is grabbing some of the background as well. And in fact, we can best show this in this example. So let's just shut this off, and maybe we only want to have outlines showing up on our subject. Well, we could basically select the comp, hit G, bring up the pen tool, and we'll just mask around here. Hit F, feather it out a lot, and then bring the effects back on. And now we have the outlines contained to only our subject. And in fact, we'll also tone down this contrast to what it was before. And also just make sure we bring these layers back on. And go back to the composite comp. If I toggle the visibility of the outlines, you can see they're only affecting the subject itself. So that should help even more with focusing the attention of the effect onto your subjects. But anyway, we were taking a look at this other clip, so let's just go back for a moment and we'll lock the composite comp, turn off the colorization effects, and let's go back to the outlines and even shut off the mask. And all you have to do is really just tweak the curves effect, maybe add some pre-blur before you find those edges, and then use the Luma key effect to determine how much of those found edges you want to keep. So you can see if we turn that all the way off, there's just way too much going on. But with it on, you can then tweak the threshold, switch this down a bit, just to determine what you're keeping and what you're not keeping. And of course, if you do want to add specific colors to specific areas, duplicate the adjustment layers, you mask off individual areas, animate the masks, and you're good to go. Alright guys, so we pretty much reached the end of the tutorial. Sorry for jumping a bit back and forth there towards the end, but I do want to make sure I cover as much as possible just to give you an idea on how you can mix and match techniques with each other. So hopefully you don't mind me jumping around a bit and taking a bit of extra time to explain these things. And with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the outro of this tutorial. Alright guys, that was all for today's tutorial. So once again, thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Remember, you can download the project files on my Gumroad page where you will find the original footage so you can practice and follow along, and even the project file itself for free, but you do have the option to support the channel with a donation. If you have any questions or suggestions for future tutorials, then feel free to leave a comment down below. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.